Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Faraday Institute Research Seminar. So this afternoon, it's a pleasure for us to welcome Professor Christian List. He is Professor of Philosophy and Political Science in the Department of Philosophy, Logic and Scientific Method in the London School of Economics. His first degree was from Oxford, where he read mathematics and philosophy, and that was followed by an MPhil and a DPhil in politics, also from Oxford. He's worked in various places, including the Australian National University, and has been visiting fellow in a number of places around the world. He's in the last year, 2019, he published a book entitled Why Free Will is Real. I could hold that up and publicize that for him. I'm sure he'd be delighted for you to purchase a copy. And it's that sort of topic they'll be talking on this afternoon, on speaking of the naturalistic case for free will. Professor List, it's a pleasure to welcome you this afternoon, and I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's great to be part of this series. So let me share my screen so that I can show some slides. Are you able to see my slides now?
Yes, I can see them. That's fine.
Okay,
thank you.
Perfect. Great. So I'll be talking to you about the naturalistic case for free will. Free will, on a first gloss, is an agent's capacity to choose and control his or her own actions. A very familiar idea. Sometimes this is also called freedom of action or freedom of choice, but I'm going to use free will as the conventional term. Now, this idea that we are capable of choosing and controlling our own actions is very much central to our self-understanding as agents. And it's also central to our practices of assigning responsibility to one another, both in morality and in the law. So it's fair to say that this idea of free will is one of those central ideas that we take to define the human condition. Now, free will, however familiar and natural it seems, has come under attack both in science and also in popular commentary on science. And if you look at popular science writings, for instance, you browse through the popular science section of a bookshop, or you read popular science magazines, you're likely to come across plenty of articles or books that argue that free will is an illusion. And I'll just give you one representative quotation. I could have chosen many such quotations. Here it is. Our thoughts and actions are the outputs of a computer made of meat, our brain, a computer that must obey the laws of physics. Our choices, therefore, must also obey those laws. This undermines the traditional idea of free will, that our lives comprise a series of decisions in which we could have chosen otherwise. This is Jerry Coyne, a biologist, in his answer to the question, what scientific idea is ready for retirement? And his response was, free will is an idea ready for retirement. Now, skepticism about free will is less common in academic philosophy. So if you ask academic philosophers, as David Bourget and David Chalmers did in a 2014 survey, you'll find that a vast majority of them affirm some notion of free will. Of course, they disagree very much on the precise details of how to define free will and how it works, but by and large, many academic philosophers believe that there is free will suitably defined. So in this survey, almost 60% describe themselves as free will compatibilists, people who believe that free will can fit into even a deterministic worldview. And just under 14% describe themselves as free will libertarians. But nonetheless, free will skepticism is definitely gaining prominence in public discourse. What I want to do here in this short talk is show, or at least give you a sketch of the argument that free will can be defended against this growing skepticism. And crucially, we can defend free will without denying science or without redefining free will itself. I mean, it should be evident that one way to defend free will against scientifically motivated skepticism would be simply to give a watered down definition of free will, and the conflict disappears. But this is perhaps not so compelling, because after all, then we'd be giving up some of the ideas that we typically associate with free will. So the central thesis that I'm going to defend is that, far from being undermined by a scientific worldview, the idea of free will is actually supported by it. And as I already mentioned, I'm only able to sketch my argumentative strategy here, given the time constraints. More details are in my book on why free will is real, as mentioned at the outset, and also in a series of articles, including some articles that I jointly wrote with Peter Menzies and Wlodek Rabinovich. And you can actually find all my articles on my webpage, where they can be downloaded as PDF files. In this talk, I'll begin by giving you a summary of what I take the scientifically motivated challenge for free will to be. Then I'll give an initial diagnosis of what I think is going on with that challenge. And that then puts me in a position to outline my argument in support of free will. And I'll finally conclude with some broader remarks. So let's begin with a challenge. Now, a reasonable starting point for any discussion of free will is the assumption that free will requires at least some, or perhaps even all, of the following properties. First of all, intentional agency. Clearly, only those entities or systems or organisms that qualify as intentional agents could possibly qualify as bearers of free will. If we take my water bottle here that I have, that's a physical entity which is obviously not an intentional agent, and it would not even begin to qualify as a bearer of free will. So to be a candidate for having free will, an entity or an organism has to be an intentional agent. That's the first condition. Secondly, free will requires alternative possibilities among which to choose. This is the famous idea that I only have free will if in a particular action I could have done otherwise. So for instance, this morning I had breakfast and I faced a choice between whether to have tea or coffee. And on this occasion, I chose to have coffee. But I firmly believe that I could have had tea instead. The alternative possibility was entirely available to me, even though I did not choose it. And this can do otherwise requirement is a very familiar idea behind the notion of free will. And ideally, of course, we'd like to think that we have alternative possibilities, not just when we make trivial choices, such as between coffee and tea, but also when we face more significant choices, such as whether to get married or which career path to pursue, and so on. A third property that we often associate with free will is the property of causation of our actions by the relevant mental states, especially by our or by the relevant agent's intentions. This idea is also called mental causation. So in order for my action, for instance, my action to lift this glass, to qualify as a free action, a freely performed action of mine, rather than just a mere bodily movement, it has to be the case that my appropriate intentional mental state was the cause of the action. The action was not just the cause, was not just caused by some underlying subconscious, sub-intentional physical process in my brain and body over which I had no control. Now, not every proponent of free will thinks that all three properties are needed for free will. I already mentioned that a number of academic philosophers are so-called free will compatibilists, and many free will compatibilists think that while free will does require intentional agency, and perhaps it also requires some appropriate form of mental causation, it does not require alternative possibilities among which we can choose. So on a compatibilist picture, for instance, it is sufficient for free will that I stand in the right relationship of ownership or authorship or endorsement relative to my actions. So this is just one example of a definition of free will that doesn't invoke all three properties. But nonetheless, I want to grant for the sake of my argument here that free will really requires suitable versions of all three properties. So by defining free will in a relatively demanding way, I think that this definition is more likely to line up with our conventional common sense understanding of free will. And also, of course, if I'm able to defend free will under a somewhat more demanding definition, then my overall conclusion is going to be stronger, and then I'm in a better position to respond to the scientific challenges for free will. Now, the free will skeptics usually proceed as follows. They focus on one or more of these three properties. Let's call the property of interest property P, and then they claim that science shows there is no such thing as P, whether it is intentional agency, alternative possibilities, or mental causation. In particular, they say property P is not to be found among the fundamental physical features of the world. Perhaps property P is just a convenient fiction of our folk psychological way of thinking, a leftover from a pre-scientific age. And then if property P is indeed required for free will, then it would seem to follow that there is no free will. Now, different more specific arguments against free will can then be viewed as instances of this general scheme, and in particular, they target different substitution instances for property P. Some arguments suggest that intentional agency is an illusion. So there are no genuine intentional systems in a physical world. The physical world somehow lacks intentionality altogether. I call this line of argument the challenge from radical materialism. And there are not just popular science versions of this, but there are also some very sophisticated academic versions of this. For instance, the philosophers Patricia and Paul Churchland have argued for a radically neuroscientific approach to the philosophy of mind, in which psychological cognitive mental states are basically replaced from our scientific vocabulary and discourse, and instead all explanations are supposed to be offered at the level of the brain as a biological system. A second set of arguments assert that we have no alternative possibilities in a deterministic universe. If the universe is deterministic, then given the world's initial condition, perhaps at the time of the Big Bang, only one trajectory of subsequent physical states of the universe would have been possible under the laws of nature, and this would seem to eliminate any scope for alternative possibilities. There'd never be a fork in the road ahead of us at which we can make choices, such as my trivial choice between coffee and tea this morning. This is the challenge from determinism, and it is the by far most widely discussed challenge for free will. A sophisticated academic version of it can be found in Peter van Inwagen's so-called consequence argument for the incompatibility of free will and determinism. A third set of arguments insists that our intentions, even if those intentions exist, never cause our actions. Rather, when I act, they say, it is my brain that makes me do it. Intentions are only subjectively experienced byproducts. We can call this the challenge from epiphenomenalism. So the idea is that these intentional mental states that we normally take to be causally efficacious when we think about free actions are in fact just epiphenomena of underlying subconscious, subintentional physical processes. It's all the action lies at the level of those physical processes. And Again, there are also not just popular science versions of this, but there are sophisticated academic versions of this. Benjamin Libet and colleagues conducted some famous neuroscience experiments since the early 1980s, in which they argued that neuronal readiness potentials in the brain, patterns of brain activation, which apparently is ever so slightly precede consciously perceived intentions to act, are the real causes of human actions rather than those intentions. And a lot could be said about those very interesting and influential experiments. And the philosopher of mind, Jakwon Kim, produced some also very influential and very interesting conceptual arguments challenging the idea of mental causation against the context of a physicalist worldview. Now, these are formidable challenges, and I think we ought to take them seriously. And they raise the question of how, if at all, we can defend free will. And this takes me now to an initial diagnosis. This naturalistically motivated free will skepticism typically takes a fairly reductionistic perspective on human beings. In effect, I would argue it views people primarily as physical systems, heaps of interacting particles, you might say, governed by the physical laws of nature. And it is no surprise that from that physical perspective, one finds little support for intentional agency, alternative possibilities for choice, or mental causation, because these notions simply do not occur in the descriptions of the world given to us by the physical sciences. Indeed, we don't even need to think of the physical sciences narrowly, just as including quantum mechanics, classical physics, and so on. But even in neuroscience, which looks at the brain in the first place as a biophysical system, those notions also do not by themselves occur. Instead, you've got neural activity, neural firing patterns, signal transmissions between neurons, and so on and so on. But that's very much below the level at which we would normally attribute intentional agency, any such thing as explicit intentional choice or mental causation. But crucially, the sciences are not restricted to the physical sciences alone. And the claim that I want to defend is that it is in the special sciences, such as the human and social sciences, combined with a non-reductive physicalist approach, that one can find support for free will and its prerequisites. Let me give you an analogy. Think of organisms, universities, or economic growth, all very familiar phenomena that are very much part of our day-to-day ontology of the world. If we look at the world solely through the lens of physics, those phenomena will remain hidden from view. I mean, if you were to try to think about the world solely through the Schrödinger wave function of quantum mechanics, for instance, you wouldn't see organisms, universities, or economic growth. But of course, it would never occur to us to deny their reality. From the fact that biological and social phenomena are absent from physical descriptions, it doesn't follow that they are unreal. Rather, they are higher level phenomena. They are products of physical processes, to be sure, but they are not describable using the concepts and categories of the physical sciences alone. And I want to suggest that what is true for those other higher level phenomena is equally true for the properties required for free will, namely agency, choice, and causal control. So those two emerge from physical processes. In fact, we can think of those as phenomena that in philosophical lingo are supervenient on physical processes, but they don't feature in fundamental physical descriptions of the world, nor do they even typically feature in neuroscientific descriptions of the world. They only feature in descriptions of the world given to us by some of the appropriate special sciences of the human and social behavior, for instance. Now, with these preliminary remarks, I can now give you an outline of my main argument. My overall argument is basically an indispensability argument. Its first premise is this: our best explanations of human behavior depict human beings as choice-making agents with beliefs, desires, and intentions, with alternative possibilities to choose from and with mental causation. This depiction, so the first premise asserts, is indispensable for explanatory purposes in the human and social sciences, and it is compatible with the rest of science. Now, this premise is a scientific premise. Whether it's true or false depends very much on what picture of humans is indeed given to us by the human and social sciences. But I'll say more about why I think this premise is indeed true. The second premise of my overall argument is this: if postulating certain properties or entities is indispensable in our best explanations of a given phenomenon and also compatible with the rest of science, then we are at least provisionally warranted in taking those properties or entities to be real. This is a philosophical premise. It's a premise concerning philosophical ontology. It's also known as the naturalistic ontological attitude, and it's a standard idea behind many arguments for scientific realism in other branches of science. So why, for instance, do we believe that electrons and photons and Higgs bosons are real? Well, the answer is that postulating those entities is indispensable in our best explanation of the relevant class of phenomena, in that example, phenomena within particle physics, and also postulating those entities is compatible with the rest of science. And scientific realists, then based on this naturalistic ontological attitude, do indeed treat those entities as real. Now, if we put those two premises together, then we reach the conclusion that we are at least provisionally warranted in taking intentional agency, alternative possibilities, and mental causation to be real. And then we would have a at least provisional naturalistic case for free will. The proviso that all of this is provisional is just a standard proviso that we find in any scientific case for the reality of some entity or property, because after all, it is always possible that we may need to fine-tune our ontology of the world on the basis of future scientific discoveries. But that proviso alone does not normally prevent us from taking a realist attitude towards many other entities and properties in the sciences. Now, my goal here is to defend free will against naturalistically driven skepticism. And for this reason, I'm going to take the second premise, the naturalistic ontological attitude, as given, because it is very much supported by standard arguments for scientific realism. And I take the more contentious premise on which much of the disagreement is centered to be the first premise, namely the premise concerning the explanatory indispensability of postulating free will and its prerequisites. So my task then is to defend this first premise, the claim that the picture of humans as choice-making agents is indeed indispensable in the human and social sciences and compatible with the rest of science. Now, in my book, I try to do this in detail. So I devote one chapter to each ingredient of this picture of humans: intentional agency, alternative possibilities to choose from, and mental causation. Here, given time constraints, I'll talk only relatively briefly about intentional agency, and then I'll focus a bit more on alternative possibilities, because that's also one of the central notions, central properties for free will, on which there has been a lot of discussion. And I'll omit the discussion of mental causation given time constraints. Now, let me begin with intentional agency. Even though the human and social sciences, which range from anthropology and psychology to sociology and economics, differ very widely in their methods, one feature that they all have in common is this. They all understand humans as intentional agents, beings with goals and beliefs and a capacity for perception and thought, who act in at least approximately intelligible ways. It's perhaps this point is not typically recognized enough. After all, there is a lot of disagreement between different disciplines in the human and social sciences. And in the face of all of this disagreement about specifics, people sometimes miss the point that there is also a very fundamental area of agreement, namely with respect to this overall intentional picture of human beings. Consider questions such as the following. Why do people usually show up for work rather than stay at home? Why do they choose one consumption bundle rather than another? Why and when do they keep their promises? Why do they vote the way they do? And we could add many other questions, also more complicated questions of the sorts that we address in the human and social sciences. Now, we wouldn't know where to begin if we tried to answer these questions without viewing people as intentional agents. Intentional explanations are, for very good reasons, ubiquitous in the human and social sciences. Sub-intentional explanations, for instance, physical explanations, or even neuroscientific explanations that focus on brain implementation details, aren't capable of accounting for human behavior in its full breadth and flexibility. I mean, if you were to use only the explanatory resources of the physical sciences or even of neuroscience alone, you would have a very, very hard time answering these 4 questions that I've listed here and numerous other questions that we ask about human behavior. I think those sub-intentional explanations can be better viewed as attempts to illuminate the neural implementation mechanisms of intentional agency. And that's, of course, very important. But they do not thereby replace intentional explanations. I really do not mean to belittle the insights that we get from the neurosciences. I think neuroscience is extremely important. And it's, of course, remarkable that such a complex phenomenon as intentional agency emerges from physical and biological processes in the brain and body. And so we rightly want to understand more about the mechanisms by which the human organism pulls that off. But nonetheless, illuminating those implementation mechanisms is not the same as replacing explanations of human and social behavior at the cognitive, intentional, mental, psychological level. And so for the time being, I want to emphasize that postulating intentional agency continues to be explanatorily indispensable. And I have very significant doubts about any claims to the effect that it will ever be explanatorily dispensable. And I could say more about this, but in the interest of time, I move on to alternative possibilities, because I actually think that the case for the indispensability of attributions of intentional agency is really almost overwhelming. Now, once we explain people's behavior by viewing them as intentional agents, the idea that they have alternative possibilities to choose from actually becomes indispensable too. And this is a much less widely recognized point. So it's worth discussing it in a bit more detail. Consider questions such as, why does an agent act in such and such a way? Or what would he or she do in such and such a situation? When we answer those questions, we hypothesize that this agent, first of all, is faced with some options, which are his or her possible choices. Secondly, we hypothesize that the agent considers those options or deliberates about those options. And this can take a variety of forms. It could range from slow and rational, in quotes, to fast and spontaneous, but some mental consideration of the options is certainly happening, on processing of the options. And then finally, we hypothesize that the agent selects one option from amongst the possible ones in a way that is at least broadly intelligible, perhaps approximately rational, given the agent's beliefs and desires. I want to emphasize that whenever you approach the kinds of questions that I mentioned earlier, or when we generally ask questions about why people do certain things or why they act in certain ways, we always either explicitly or implicitly engage in a 3-step explanation of this sort here, which I've schematically summarized in terms of the idea that the agent is faced with some options, which are the possible choices, then somehow considers those options, deliberates about them, processes them, and then finally selects an option in a more or less intelligible way. And this way of explaining behavior would not be possible if we didn't suppose that people have alternative possibilities to choose from. I mean, without step one in this three-step explanatory scheme, the whole explanatory scheme doesn't get off the ground. Recall these earlier examples of questions that I gave you. Why do people show up for work? Why do they choose a particular consumption bundle? Standard question in microeconomics, for instance. Why and when do they keep their promises? Again, important and interesting psychological question. Why do they vote the way they do? An important question in political psychology or political science that we ask all the time. An intentional explanation of the relevant behaviors wouldn't get off the ground if we didn't suppose that people make choices between different possible options. Indeed, the background presupposition, even in asking these questions, is that people are faced with choices, and we want to explain why they make choices in one particular way rather than in another particular way. If you thought of people just as choice-free physical systems inexorably pursuing one ex-ante fixed trajectory, you'd not be able to engage in intentional explanation of those behaviors at all. And even in economics, with its at first sight mechanistic behavior of people as maximizers of utility, though in reality the picture is actually more sophisticated than the caricature, the notion of choice between different options is absolutely central. So this presupposition that the presupposition here and elsewhere in the social sciences is that agents sometimes face choices, and when they do, more than one option is in principle possible for them, even though only some of the options may ultimately be rational and considered choice-worthy upon reflection. So an agent's trajectory up to any relevant choice node, we assume, admits different agentially possible continuations. This just is the fundamental presupposition behind all of these instances of intentional explanation in the human and social sciences. And I call this thesis agential indeterminism. Now, this idea can be illustrated nicely by considering an extensive form decision tree of the sort that we often model in decision and game theory. I'm sure many people in the audience will have seen such decision trees. Here, this tree represents all the possible decision paths that the relevant agent could take moving from bottom to top. So the dots are choice nodes where the agent is making a choice. So this tree represents all the possible decision paths that the relevant agents could take moving from bottom to top. Each dot here is a choice node where the agent faces a choice, and then the agent could take one choice as represented by going left in this diagram, or take another choice as represented by going right. And now our relevant explanatory theory might tell us that one particular path or a subset of those paths are the predicted or rational ones. So here in this diagram, the red path, for instance, might stand for the predicted or rational path. But crucially, even though our theories might predict that the agent, if rational, will take one path rather than another through this tree, the key presupposition still remains that the other alternative possible paths remain possible as well. So identifying one path as rational or predicted is not the same as asserting that somehow the other paths through this tree would have been impossible. So this is a paradigm example of the presupposition of alternative possibilities in action within our social scientific explanations. I also want to emphasize that agential indeterminism doesn't mean that choices are random. It merely means that people face choices between different options that are in principle possible. And this is consistent with some options being rational and identified as rational in deliberation, and others not. This distinction between what is possible to do and what is rational to do is very much at the heart of decision theory of the sort that we use in many of the social sciences. And my claim is simply that in explanations of human behavior, we routinely assume non-singleton sets of possible options where different alternative trajectories are agentially possible for an agent. Now, even if I'm right that agential indeterminism is indeed presupposed by the human and social sciences, one might still worry that this somehow conflicts with physical determinism, and the physical sciences have not yet conclusively ruled out physical determinism. I mean, there's some debate about whether quantum mechanics might support an indeterministic picture of the world, but that also depends very much on the precise interpretation of quantum mechanics that we adopt. So I think at this point, we cannot assume that a conclusive answer has been given by the sciences as to whether we should think of the fundamental physical laws as deterministic or not. Physical determinism, roughly speaking, is the thesis that the fully specified physical trajectory of the world up to any time admits only one possible future continuation under the laws of physics. So a caricature version of this would say that the initial physical state of the universe at the time of the Big Bang already predetermined all the subsequent events, including, for instance, the fact that we are now engaged in this online seminar at this very moment. This would have been, in a sense, sort of written into the world's initial conditions under the laws of nature, given physical determinism. And then one would, of course, immediately worry that this conflicts with this idea of indeterminism at the level of agency. So just as the date and time of the next solar eclipse in London is fixed by the current state of the solar system, this line of reasoning seems to imply that all future human actions are fixed. My response here is that indeterminism at the level of agency is compatible with determinism at the level of physics. At first sight, this may seem a little surprising, but as I argue in my book and also in some earlier papers, the distinction between determinism and indeterminism is best understood as a level relative distinction. What do I mean by this? By this, I mean that it's not meaningful to ask, is the world deterministic or indeterministic as such? Rather, this question becomes meaningful only once we specify the level of description relative to which we are asking this question. So for each level of description at which we might be analyzing the world, explaining the world, be it the physical level, the biological level, the psychological level, the social level, and so on, we can ask a level-specific question of whether the world is deterministic or indeterministic at that particular level. And the answer may depend on the level in question and may vary from level to level. A system can be deterministic at one level, such as the level of fundamental physics, for instance, and indeterministic at another, such as the level of some special science, such as biology, psychology, or sociology. In fact, even physicists recognize that you can have systems that behave according to statistical mechanics at a macro level of description and look indeterministic, while behaving deterministically at a classical mechanics level of description of microphysics, for instance. And then one can have a big debate about how best to interpret such level-specific determinism or indeterminism. But my argument here, which I can here only very quickly summarize, is that if we take the naturalistic ontological attitude seriously, then we have good grounds for being realists about higher level indeterminism, for instance, to the extent that it is indeed a necessary explanatory ingredient in our best scientific explanations of the phenomena at the relevant level. So the upshot here is when we move from a lower microscopic level to a higher macroscopic one, we may see a kind of phase transition from deterministic to indeterministic dynamics. Or as Jeremy Butterfield, the philosopher of physics in Cambridge, puts it, systems micro and macro level dynamics need not mesh. So micro level determinism can coexist with macro level indeterminism, for instance, and vice versa. Another colleague in the philosophy of physics, Charlotte Vandel, has also produced some related formal results, even suggesting that deterministic and indeterministic descriptions of the world may be observationally indistinguishable. If I had more time, I would talk you through a toy example. I'll here just show you two quick diagrams where I redescribe one and the same system at two different levels. A lower level with the system's microstates and microtrajectories, and a higher level with the system's macrostates and macrotrajectories. And what this toy example is meant to illustrate is that one and the same system, when you switch from lower level descriptions to higher level descriptions, may also switch from displaying deterministic dynamics, as in this lower level scenario here, to indeterministic dynamics, as in this higher level scenario here. And as I already indicated, I take a scientific realist interpretation of such emergent higher level indeterminism. For more details on this example and the technical background behind it, I can also refer the audience to a slightly more technical paper, which is on my webpage, Free Will, Determinism, and the Possibility of Doing Otherwise. Okay, so the bottom line is that the agential indeterminism assumed by the human and social sciences need not conflict with physical determinism. Indeed, lower level indeterminism is neither necessary nor even sufficient for higher level indeterminism. Let me wrap up. The picture of free will that I have sketched here is metaphysically libertarian in one respect and compatibilist in another. It's metaphysically libertarian insofar as it accepts alternative possibilities as a requirement for free will, and it also affirms that humans have alternative possibilities. But it is compatibilist insofar as it renders all of this compatible with physical determinism through the observation that higher level indeterminism is indeed compatible with lower level determinism. Thereby, I think this offers a reframing of the traditional free will debate by showing that there is a form of free will libertarianism that is in fact compatibilist. Now, this defense of free will is clearly contingent on the nature of our best scientific explanations in the human and social sciences. And should we ever arrive at a compelling reductionistic or deterministic theory of human behavior, then the first premise of my argument, namely the premise about the explanatory indispensability of postulating the prerequisites for free will, this would no longer be true, and then my conclusion would no longer follow. But for the time being, I don't expect science to be heading in this direction. And so I maintain that free will is no less real than other higher level properties or entities like organisms, universities, or economic growth, whose reality we seldom doubt. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that illuminating seminar. Now, how we're going to proceed now is that people can put questions in the Q&A. You're totally free to do so. There's no determinism in that. You can choose to put them in there. I'll relay them to the speaker, and we have quite a time now for question and answer. So let me kick off first of all and actually say your description of different levels was very helpful, but I suppose the reductionist scientists would want to say, how do those levels communicate with each other? Is there an interaction? Are they totally independent? And are we actually in danger of invoking a kind of dualism within that?
Yes, yeah. So especially if we want to address scientifically motivated free will skepticism, then we would not be able to give a compelling response by invoking some form of dualism, because then we would no longer share some of the key premises of the skeptics. So it is very important to emphasize that this defense of free will is entirely compatible with a physicalist worldview, according to which all properties of phenomena, certainly all those that can be third-personally described, are somehow at least indirect products of underlying physical processes, and we capture this through the notion of supervenience. So higher level properties of phenomena supervene on physical ones. That is to say that if we were to, for instance, hypothetically replicate all the physical properties and physical phenomena in the world and put them into a parallel universe, faithfully replicated, then the resulting higher level properties and phenomena would also thereby have been replicated. We would not need to throw something else into the mix to make the replication complete. So that's the sort of physicalist idea. And this defense of free will upholds this physicalist idea. So higher level facts still supervene on lower level facts, but crucially, they are not reducible to them. So I think some of the skeptics, while of course accepting supervenience, tend to draw a stronger conclusion from supervenience than I think is warranted. So some people think that once higher level properties, for instance, psychological ones, supervene on physical properties, this means that those higher level properties are also reducible to the physical ones. I emphasize the point that supervenience does not imply reducibility. So you could have supervenience of higher level phenomena on lower level ones, and yet for explanatory purposes, we can't dispense with references to those higher level phenomena in our discourse, and we've got to take higher level properties and entities as perfectly real.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me pick a few questions that are coming in, and I'll read this one in full so as to make sure I don't misrepresent the questioner. Does not even the existence of science as a rational practice presuppose that scientists can make rational, uncaused decisions that aim at recognizing truth and are not the result of a causal nexus which may or may not be connected to issues of truth? We can equally be caused to believe what is true and what is false.
I think this is it's an interesting question. So I mean, one might make the point that for us to be able to even engage in science, it is crucial that we are ourselves epistemic agents or rational agents as scientists, and unless we do indeed have intentional agency and some of the additional properties that I take to be required for free will, we might not be able to compellingly even engage in science itself. And so it would seem perhaps that free will is not just a presupposition of the standard picture of humans as choice-making intentional agents, but perhaps it is also a presupposition of the kinds of capacities that are required to engage in the rational scientific inquiry itself. It's a line of reasoning that I think that has some plausibility.
Thank you. So here's a question who says they agree with your argument that very little in our social worlds, including our academic lives, makes sense without belief in free will. However, the history of science shows that our beliefs and ways of making sense of the world offer no assurance that we are right. There are all kinds of rituals in different societies that make sense to those that were involved, but seem totally misguided and external to the observer. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I discuss this line of reasoning a little bit in my book as well. So I mean, it's true, for instance, that our ancestors would have attributed intentionality to far more phenomena in the world than we do. I mean, our ancestors might have attributed intentionality to perhaps to the ocean and to a storm and to all sorts of natural phenomena. which we now think we can explain scientifically without any intentionality ascriptions. And so some of the scientific free will skeptics would say, well, this trend is going to continue, and intentionality ascriptions in the long term are going to disappear even from the explanations of human behavior. Now, I mean, here the issue is really which ingredients of our folk theories of the world are there to stay and will remain ingredients even of a sophisticated scientific worldview, and which ingredients of our folk theories of the world will disappear. And it's true that some ingredients of our folk theories of the world, step by step, have disappeared and have been replaced by something else. But I mean, my argument is not so much and not primarily that we need to invoke an intentional stance towards people, as the philosopher Daniel Dennett, from whom I've learned a lot, puts it, in order to make sense of human behavior in day-to-day life. I mean, that's of course absolutely true. We can't navigate through our day-to-day life without viewing people as intentional agents. But my point is furthermore that intentional explanations are also required for our best scientific explanations of human behavior in the human and social sciences. And so a lot will depend on whether I'm right that this feature of the human and social sciences is there to stay, in the same way in which some other features have kind of stabilized in our scientific worldview, or whether eventually it'll be driven out by a more reductionistic neuroscientific perspective. And here I'm quite willing to argue, and have argued in my writings, that we have good reasons to think that intentional explanations are going to stay in science.
Thank you. Can I, a question who wants to pose a little bit further the question of predicting or rational choices. And I suppose the question is asking, to what extent are we conditioned? We may be presented with a bowl of fruit, which is rotting fruit and fresh fruit, and we would naturally choose the fresh, I hope. That's a choice, and we've freely chosen to reject the rotting one. But we're rather conditioned to do that. How about if you like, comparing that with navigating relationships, where the conditioning is very different?
Well, to say that we have free will is definitely not to say that our choices are taking place in a complete vacuum, unconstrained by background circumstances, by the environment, by incentives, by all sorts of external constraints. So sometimes we face choices between a very attractive option and a terrible option, and it's kind of a no-brainer what we're going to choose. But that is not to say that this is not in the metaphysical sense a genuine free choice that we're making. It would still have been possible for us to choose otherwise, even though in this example it would not have been rational or attractive for us to choose otherwise.
Thank you. A change of tack on this question, rather, does the choice between reductionist determinism and your model of emergentism have any implications for political philosophy or political principles?
Well, not directly. So in the first place, I mean, this is really a project in the area of metaphysics, philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, or the foundations of the human and social sciences. But of course, the assumption of free will is important, as I already mentioned, in some areas of moral, political, and legal philosophy. I already pointed out that our responsibility practices typically rest on certain free will presuppositions. In political philosophy, for instance, there is an influential view called luck egalitarianism, which says that people should be compensated for the effects of bad brute luck. On the other hand, there can also be option luck for which people bear responsibility insofar as it can be attributed to free responsible choices. And even the very fact that such distinctions are being drawn, I mean, I don't mean to here advocate luck egalitarianism necessarily as my preferred political theory, but even the fact that such distinctions are being drawn shows that the notion of free will plays some important conceptual role in the background. And so I think for this reason, getting clear about the sense in which we humans have free will is really quite important, also for understanding our normative theories of morality and society, because after all, it does make a difference to our normative picture of the human condition, whether or not we think that humans have free will in some sense, and how exactly to then understand free will. I mean, one point I want to emphasize perhaps is that many free will skeptics find the rejection of free will congenial because it allows them to argue against retributivism in the law and in relation to criminal punishment. And here I simply want to point out that I too am not a fan at all of retributivist approaches to punishment, much more in favor of a rehabilitative, restorative justice type of approach, not one that focuses on retribution. But one can certainly support a reform of the criminal justice system in a more humane way without at the same time denying free will. So those are just logically separate matters.
Great, thank you very much. I think our time is coming to a close. So I thank everybody for asking their questions, and thank you for your illuminating talk and for answering the questions the way you have done. It's been a fascinating afternoon. We've very much enjoyed you being with us and for talking to us. So let me, in finishing, thank you again, Christian, for a very illuminating talk.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. If we were in person, we would give you a round of applause. So you can take that as read from everybody else who's here. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Nice to see you. Bye-bye.